In the heart of a busy city, there was a small cafe that buzzed with life. People came here not just for coffee, but to escape their daily grind, to find a moment of peace amidst the chaos outside. On this particular afternoon, the cafe was alive with chatter, friends catching up, colleagues discussing projects, and the occasional sound of laughter breaking through the hum of conversations. Among the crowd sat a young woman, her laptop open in front of her as she typed furiously. She had a notebook beside her filled with scribbled notes, and her cup of tea was slowly growing cold. This was her space, her little corner where she could focus without distractions. But today, it seemed like distractions were inevitable. At another table nearby, a group of young men had gathered. They were loud, boisterous, and clearly enjoying themselves. Their jokes echoed across the room, drawing irritated glances from some patrons who preferred quieter surroundings. One of them stood out, a boy with an unmistakable energy about him. He wasn't tall, nor particularly imposing, but his voice carried far beyond what anyone would consider polite. His friends hung on to every word he said, laughing at even his weakest punchlines. It was clear he thrived on attention, feeding off the reactions he got from those around him. As the girl worked on her presentation, half listening to the background noise, something caught her ear. The boy had launched into yet another story, but this time it wasn't just harmless banter. "You know," he said loudly, leaning back in his chair with exaggerated confidence, "women always make such a big deal out of nothing, like they take offense to everything." His friends chuckled nervously, unsure if they should agree or stay silent. But the boy didn't seem to care. He was on a roll now. The girl stopped typing mid-sentence. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she processed what she'd just heard. At first, she thought maybe she misheard him. Maybe he hadn't meant it the way it sounded. But then he continued, his tone dripping with mockery. "Seriously, though, why do women always have to act so emotional? Can't they just chill?" By now, several heads in the cafe had turned toward their table. Some people exchanged uncomfortable looks, while others pretended not to notice. The tension in the air grew thicker with each passing second. And then, almost casually, the boy pointed across the room at her. Yes, her. The girl sitting quietly, with her laptop, minding her own business. "You know what I'm talking about," he shouted, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "Women like you always get offended over nothing." For a split second, the entire cafe fell silent. Every eye in the room shifted to the girl. Some looked sympathetic, others curious, and a few even judgmental. The boy grinned smugly, clearly proud of himself for making such a bold statement. His friends laughed awkwardly, trying to keep up appearances despite the palpable discomfort spreading through the room. Girl felt her cheeks flush. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, especially not like this. Part of her wanted to shrink into her seat, gather her things, and leave. Another part of her wanted to snap back, to defend herself and call him out for his ignorance. But instead, she didn't either. She took a deep breath, closed her laptop gently, and stood up. Everyone watched as she stepped away from her table. There was no rush in her movements, no sign of panic or anger. Instead, she walked calmly toward the center of the cafe, where the acoustics naturally amplified any sound. As she moved, the room seemed to hold its collective breath. What was she going to do? Was she going to yell, cry, walk out? When she reached the middle of the room, she paused. For a moment, she simply stood there, letting the silence settle. Then, with quiet authority, she raised her hand slightly. Simple gesture, yet enough to command everyone's attention. Even the boy, who moments ago had been brimming with bravado, found himself staring at her, unsure of what to expect next. And then she spoke. Her voice was soft but steady, carrying a weight that silenced even the faintest whisper in the room. "Let me tell you something," she began, her eyes scanning the crowd before landing firmly on the boy. "I could argue with you all day about why your words are wrong, but instead, I want to ask you something." Her question hung in the air, sharp and unexpected, leaving the boy and everyone else waiting to hear what came next. The cafe was so quiet you could almost hear the steam rising from the cups of coffee. Every single person in the room had their eyes fixed on the girl standing in the center. She wasn't yelling, she wasn't crying, she was just there, calm and composed, and that's what made it so powerful. The boy who had been shouting earlier looked confused, like he didn't know how to respond. He shifted in his seat, his earlier confidence crumbling under the weight of her steady gaze. "Do you think shouting insults at strangers makes you look strong?" she asked, her voice firm but not harsh. "Or does it just show everyone here exactly how insecure you really are?" Her words hit like a punch. You could see it in his face. He wasn't expecting that. His friends, who had been laughing along with him just moments ago, suddenly seemed uncomfortable. They glanced at each other, unsure whether they should say something or stay silent. Some of them even leaned back in their chairs, trying to distance themselves from the spotlight. But the girl wasn't done yet. She turned slightly, addressing the rest of the cafe now. "We've all heard comments like these before," she said, her tone softening just a bit. "Remarks designed to tear someone down because it's easier than building yourself up. But let me remind you of something." She paused for a moment, letting her words sink in. "Courage isn't about raising your voice. It's about standing up for what's right even when it's hard." You could feel the mood in the room shifting. People weren't just watching anymore. They were listening. There was something about the way she spoke, calm, clear, and full of conviction, that made you want to pay attention. Even the baristas behind the counter had stopped working, leaning against the counter to hear what she would say next. She turned back to the boy, her expression unflinching. "If you have a problem with women leading, maybe it's not them you're angry at. Maybe it's the outdated ideas you've chosen to believe. And guess what? You can change that. We all can." For a moment, no one moved. No one even breathed. Then, slowly, someone started clapping. It was tentative at first, just a few hesitant claps from an older woman sitting near the window. But then another person joined in, and another, until the entire cafe erupted into applause. The sound filled the room, drowning out everything else. People were nodding, smiling, whispering to each other about how brave she was. The boy sat there, frozen. His face turned bright red as he realized everyone was looking at him, not with admiration, but with disapproval. He opened his mouth to say something, anything, but no words came out. His friends tried to laugh it off, nudging him and making jokes, but their hearts weren't in it. They knew things had changed. The energy in the room had shifted, and there was no going back. As the applause died down, the girl gave a small nod, as if to acknowledge the support she'd received. Then, without another word, she walked back to her table, picked up her laptop, and slipped it into her bag. She didn't look at the boy again. She didn't need to. Her message had been delivered loud and clear. People began talking among themselves, buzzing about what had just happened. Some praised her courage, while others admitted they wished they had spoken up too. A young couple nearby whispered about how inspiring she was, while an older man shook his head, muttering something about kids these days needing to learn respect. The atmosphere was electric, charged with emotion and reflection. Meanwhile, the boy sat slumped in his chair, staring at the table in front of him. His friends tried to lighten the mood, cracking jokes and teasing him gently, but he barely responded. For the first time in a long time, he felt small. Not because of what the girl had said, but because deep down he knew she was right. He had spent years hiding behind loud words and brash behavior, thinking it made him look tough. But now, surrounded by a room full of people who saw right through him, He realized how hollow it all was. One of his friends finally broke the silence. "Man, that was brutal," he said, half jokingly. "What are you going to do now?" The boy shrugged, still staring. At the table. "I don't know," he muttered. Maybe I should apologize." His friend raised an eyebrow. "Apologize? To her?" "Dude, she totally owned you back there." "I know," the boy replied quietly. "That's why I should apologize." There was a pause as his friend processed this. "You serious?" "Yeah," the boy said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I messed up. And I think I need to fix it." His friend didn't say anything after that. He just nodded, giving him a pat on the back. The boy took a deep breath, feeling a strange mix of shame and determination wash over him. He didn't know if apologizing would make things better, or if she'd even accept it, but he knew he had to try. For the first time in his life, he wanted to do the right thing, even if it meant swallowing his pride. As the girl left the cafe, stepping out into the crisp afternoon air, she didn't look back. She didn't need to. She had said what needed to be said, and she hoped it would leave a lasting impression. Little did she know, it already had. The next few days passed in a blur for the boy. He couldn't stop thinking about what had happened at the cafe. It wasn't just the girl's words that haunted him, it was the way she said them, the calm confidence in her voice, and the way everyone in the room seemed to agree with her. He replayed the scene over and over in his mind, cringing every time he remembered how small he felt under her gaze. At first, he tried to brush it off. "It's not a big deal," he told himself. "People say stupid things all the time. Why should I care?" But no matter how hard he tried to convince himself, the memory lingered. He kept picturing the disapproving looks from the other customers, the awkward silence when she finished speaking, and the thunderous applause that followed. Worst of all, he couldn't shake the feeling that she was right. One night, unable to sleep, he grabbed his phone and typed her description into a search engine. He didn't expect to find anything after all. How would he even know where to start? But as luck would have it, he stumbled across a video. In the clip, she was standing on a stage, speaking passionately to an audience about overcoming adversity and challenging societal norms. Her words were powerful, raw, and honest. Watching her speak, he realized something. This wasn't just some random stranger who had called him out in public. She was someone who dedicated her life to helping others see the world differently. Curiosity got the better of him. He spent hours watching her videos, reading articles she'd written, and learning more about the causes she supported. The more he learned, the more he began to understand why she had reacted the way she did. It wasn't personal, it was about standing up against ignorance and prejudice. And while he still felt embarrassed about his behavior, he also felt inspired. A week later, he found himself back at the same cafe. This time, he came alone. His heart pounded as he pushed open the door, scanning the room for her. To his relief, she was there, sitting at the same corner table where he'd seen her before. Her laptop was open, and she was typing furiously, just like last time. For a moment, he hesitated, unsure if he should approach her. What if she didn't want to talk to him? What if she thought he was wasting her time? But then he reminded himself why he was here. Taking a deep breath, he walked over to her table. Hi, he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I don't expect you to remember me, but I wanted to apologize. What I said was wrong, and, well, thank you for calling me out." She looked up, surprised but not unfriendly. After a brief pause, she smiled softly. "Thank you for coming back," she replied. Her tone was warm, inviting even, which put him at ease. She gestured for him to sit down, and after a moment's hesitation, he did. They started talking, tentatively. At first, he explained how her words had stayed with him, how they made him reflect on his actions and attitudes. At first, he worried she might judge him or dismiss his apology, but instead, she listened patiently. She asked questions, shared stories from her own experiences, and encouraged him to think critically about the beliefs he held. As the conversation went on, he opened up more. He admitted that he often used humor and loud behavior as a way to mask his insecurities. He confessed that he didn't really believe most of the things he said. He just said them because it was easier than confronting his own doubts. Hearing himself say these things out loud was both painful and liberating. For the first time, he felt like someone truly understood him. She nodded thoughtfully as he spoke. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong," she said. "And it takes even more courage to try to change. You've already taken the first step by coming here today." Her words gave him hope. By the end of their conversation, he felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. Before leaving, he promised her that he would do better, not just for himself, but for others too. She smiled again, this time with genuine warmth. "I believe in you," she said simply. Walking home that evening, he felt a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He knew he still had a long way to go, but for the first time, he was excited about the journey ahead. Over the next few weeks, something inside the boy began to shift. It wasn't an overnight transformation. Those kinds of changes only happen in movies, but it was real, and it was steady. He started small, almost hesitantly, by paying closer attention to the things he said and how they affected others. At first, it felt strange, like trying to break a habit he hadn't even realized he had. But every time he caught himself about to make a thoughtless comment or laugh at someone else's expense, he paused. He remembered the girl's words. Courage isn't about raising your voice. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. He also decided to educate himself more. After that conversation with her, he went online and started reading articles, watching videos, and listening to podcasts about equality, empathy, and personal growth. Some of the content was tough to digest. It challenged ideas he'd grown up believing without question, but he kept going. He knew he couldn't undo years of ingrained thinking overnight, but he was determined to try. One day, while scrolling through social media, he came across a local organization focused on promoting gender equality and empowering marginalized voices. Without overthinking it, he sent them a message asking if they needed volunteers. To his surprise, they replied almost immediately, welcoming him to join their team. At first, he felt out of place. Most of the other volunteers were older, more experienced, and seemed to know exactly what they were doing. But instead of letting that discourage him, he threw himself into the work. He helped organize events, handed out flyers, and even assisted with setting up booths at community fairs. Slowly but surely, he began to feel like he was part of something bigger than himself. Through this work, he met people who had faced challenges he could barely imagine. He listened to their stories of discrimination, resilience, and hope, and each one left a mark on him. There was a single mother who talked about struggling to balance work and family while dealing with judgment from coworkers. There was a young man who shared how toxic masculinity had shaped his childhood, and how he was now working to redefine what it meant to be strong. And there was an elderly woman who spoke passionately about fighting for women's rights long before it became mainstream. These conversations opened his eyes in ways he never expected. They made him realize that the world wasn't as simple as he'd once thought, and that everyone carried burdens he couldn't see. Inspired by these experiences, he decided to share his own story. At first, the idea terrified him. What would people think? Would they judge him for his past behavior? But then he reminded himself of the girl at the cafe, the way she had stood up and spoken her truth, even when it was uncomfortable. If she could do it, so could he. His first attempt was awkward. He stood in front of a small group of high school students, his hands shaking and his voice wavering. "I used to say things I didn't mean," he admitted, looking down at his feet. "Things that hurt people. I didn't understand why it mattered back then, but now I do, and I'm sorry." The room was silent for a moment, and he braced himself for laughter or ridicule. Instead, one of the students raised their hand. "Why did you change?" The student asked. He thought for a second before answering. "Because someone showed me that I could," he said honestly. "And because I realized I didn't want to be the kind of person who hurts others just to feel better about myself." The response was overwhelming. Students approached him after the talk, thanking him for being vulnerable and sharing his journey. Some admitted they had similar struggles, while others asked for advice on how to stand up against peer pressure. For the first time in his life, he felt truly heard, not as the loud, obnoxious guy seeking attention, but as someone who had something meaningful to contribute. As the months went by, he continued speaking at schools, community centers, and workshops. Each time, he grew more confident, more articulate, and more passionate about the message he wanted to spread. He talked about the importance of self-awareness, the value of listening to others, and the power of admitting when you're wrong. He didn't pretend to have all the answers, in fact. He often emphasized that he was still learning, but that honesty resonated with people. They saw themselves in him, and they appreciated his willingness to grow. Meanwhile, the girl who had inspired this journey remained a guiding light in his life. They stayed in touch, meeting occasionally for coffee or exchanging messages online. She never treated him like a project or someone in need of fixing. Instead, she encouraged him, celebrated his progress, and gently nudged him whenever he doubted himself. Their friendship became one of mutual respect and admiration, built on the foundation of that pivotal moment in the cafe. One evening, as they sat together at a quiet park bench, she turned to him with a smile. "You've come such a long way," she said. "Do you remember how nervous you were when we first met?" He laughed, scratching the back of his neck. "How could I forget? I thought you'd hate me." "I never hated you," she replied softly. "I saw potential in you, even when you couldn't see it yourself." Her words filled him with gratitude. He realized how lucky he was to have crossed paths with someone who chose to challenge him rather than dismiss him. Because of her, he had discovered a version of himself he never knew existed, one that cared deeply about making the world a better place. By the end of the year, the boy had transformed in ways he never thought possible. He wasn't perfect. He still stumbled sometimes, still said things he regretted, but he was committed to learning and growing. More importantly, he had found a sense of purpose. He no longer sought validation through loud words or reckless behavior. Instead, he found fulfillment in lifting others up and using his voice not to tear down but to build bridges. And somewhere along the way, he stopped seeing the cafe incident as a moment of shame. Instead, he viewed it as the beginning of his journey, a turning point that set him on a path toward becoming the person he always hoped he could be. Months had passed since the day everything changed in that cafe. Life moved forward, as it always does, but the ripple effects of what happened that afternoon continued to spread far beyond what either the boy or the girl could have imagined. For the boy, every step he took toward growth seemed to bring new opportunities, challenges, and moments of reflection. And for the girl, watching him evolve was a reminder of why she did the work she did, because sometimes one honest moment could spark a transformation that reached far beyond two people. One evening, the city hosted a large community event at a local auditorium. The theme was Unity Through Understanding, and it brought together speakers, activists, artists, and everyday individuals who wanted to share their stories and inspire change. Posters lined the streets leading up to the venue, and the energy and the air buzzed with anticipation. People from all walks of life filled the seats, eager to listen, learn, and connect. The boy had been invited to speak at the event. When he first received the invitation, he felt a mix of excitement and dread. Speaking to small groups was one thing, but addressing hundreds of strangers? That felt like stepping into uncharted territory. Still, he reminded himself of how far he'd come and decided to embrace the opportunity. He spent days preparing his speech, practicing in front of the mirror, and rehearsing with friends until he felt ready, or at least as ready as he could be. When the night arrived, the auditorium was packed. The lights dimmed and the host introduced. Speaker after speaker, each sharing their unique perspective on unity, empathy, and progress. Finally, it was his turn. As he walked onto the stage, the spotlight hit him, and for a brief moment, he froze. His palms were sweaty, his heart raced, and he wondered if he'd made a mistake agreeing to this. But then he scanned the crowd, searching for a familiar face. And there she was, the girl who had started it all, sitting near the front with an encouraging smile. Taking a deep breath, he stepped up to the microphone. "Hi, everyone," he began, his voice shaky at first. "I'm not used to talking in front of big crowds like this, so bear with me." A few people chuckled, easing the tension, and he relaxed just enough to continue. "I wasn't always the person standing here today," he admitted. "In fact, not too long ago, I was someone completely different. I was loud, reckless, and, well, let's just say I didn't think much about the impact my words had on others." He paused, letting the weight of his confession settle. Then, one day, I said something really stupid in public, something hurtful. Instead of yelling back or walking away, a stranger stood up and called me out in front of everyone. He glanced at the girl again, who gave him a subtle nod of encouragement. At the time, I was embarrassed, angry even. But looking back, I realized that moment saved me. It forced me to confront who I was and who I wanted to become. That stranger didn't just challenge me, she inspired me. She showed me that courage isn't about being loud, it's about doing what's right, even when it's hard. His voice grew stronger as he spoke, his nerves fading with each word. Since then, I've tried to live differently. I've volunteered with organizations fighting for equality, shared my story with students, and worked hard to educate myself about issues I used to ignore. It hasn't been easy, in fact. It's probably one of the hardest things I've ever done, but it's also been the most rewarding. By now, the audience was fully engaged. Some nodded along while others leaned forward, hanging on his every word. He could feel their support, their belief in the message he was sharing. It gave him the confidence to keep going. "I'm not saying I've got everything figured out," he added with a self-deprecating smile. "I still mess up sometimes. But the difference is, now I care. I care about the words I use, the actions I take, and the kind of person I want to be. And I owe a lot of that to the woman sitting right there." He pointed toward her, and the crowd erupted into applause. She blushed, clearly uncomfortable with the attention, but the pride in her eyes was unmistakable. After finishing his speech, he returned to his seat, feeling a sense of accomplishment wash over him. Several people approached him afterward, thanking him for his honesty and vulnerability. One older man patted him on the shoulder and said, "You're proof that anyone can change if they're willing to try." Those words stayed with him long after the event ended. Later that night, as the crowd dispersed and the lights dimmed, the boy found the girl lingering near the exit. "Hey," he said, walking up to her. "Thanks for coming tonight." "Of course," she replied with a warm smile. "You were amazing up there." He shook his head, still marveling at how things had turned out. "You know, I never would have guessed that shouting match in the cafe would lead to all this," she laughed softly. "Life has a funny way of surprising us, doesn't it?" "It sure does," he agreed. But seriously, thank you. For everything. You changed my life." Her expression softened, and she placed a hand on his arm. "You changed your own life. I just gave you a little push." They stood there for a moment, reflecting on how far they'd both come. Around them, the remnants of the event buzzed with quiet conversations and shared hopes for the future. It was clear that the evening had left its mark, not just on the boy and the girl, but on everyone who had attended Dot as they parted ways, promising to stay in touch. The boy couldn't help but feel grateful for the journey he'd been on. It hadn't been easy, and it certainly wasn't perfect, but it was real. And in a world often divided by differences, finding common ground even through conflict felt like a victory worth celebrating. The next morning, as he scrolled through social media, he noticed posts about the event flooding his feed. Videos of his speech, photos of the crowd, and heartfelt messages from attendees filled the timeline. One comment stood out, asterisk. "Sometimes it takes just one person to remind us of our potential." Tonight, we saw that happen. Asterisk, reading those words, he smiled. He knew the road ahead wouldn't always be smooth, but he also knew he wasn't alone. Change wasn't something that happened overnight. It was a collective effort, fueled by honesty, courage, and connection. And as long as there were people willing to stand up, speak out, and listen, the ripple effect would continue to grow. The boy may have started as someone who shouted to fill a void, but now he was someone who spoke to make a difference. And that, he realized, was the greatest transformation of all.